Just a little bit about us. We are 3 co-founders. Gilles Retson is our CTO and Chief Architect, and Claire McAndrew is our Chief Communities Officer. It's really important that we have a Chief Communities Officer, which you'll see through the presentation. Claire is originally a social scientist, trained as a psychologist. Gilles an architect. I'm an architecture theorist. And we have a team of about 9, well, now 10 people working with us, mainly through systems automation designers, computational designers, roboticists, computer scientists, the whole gamut, but mainly architects who have kind of segged into another part of the profession. So as was mentioned, AUAR is a spin out of AUAR Labs, which is based at UCL, and we've been designing in AUAR Labs alongside our students and our collaborators a mission-driven, non-extractive, and distributed automated platform for housing. Lots of big words. Now, the end game here is really to provide an alternative or parallel future for housing that's more equitable, that's more sustainable, and more inspiring. And the designing and building of the work of the lab is very much focused on how do we build networks for the work of our commercial spin-out to then be deployed. So there's a really tight relationship between the research lab and the company. So I'm going to be skipping back and forth between projects from the lab and projects from the company today, but I'm just going to set you guys up first before I show you some of those projects. So the work of the lab really fuels our mission to radically rethink housing production. We all know housing needs to change. We're not only in the midst of a housing crisis, but we're also in a climate crisis, and that's only going to exponentially create a worse housing crisis. And automation is seen often as a possible solution to this problem, but we see a building industry that is really not set up for its adoption, and it struggles with outdated models of practice and power structures. So in our work, we like to think of how we can dismantle these practices, and how can we design an approach for architecture and automation that's better suited to deliver on these kinds of needs. And this really comes to the statement, we can't just automate the building industry. It must be entirely reinvented from the ground up. So we see our approach to automation as providing an alternative future. And we're combating some of the most dominant media narratives around automation, such as our friendly bricklaying robot that steals jobs, but solves very narrow and very localized problems in the industry. We also see it as combating the idea around the issues around construction automation investment at the scale of the factory. We see, for example, modular housing factories resulting in the centralization of production to off-site factories, and these are very disconnected to the context in which these kinds of products are deployed. And factory-made housing in the places that we're working is often seen as displacing local jobs, and this creates a kind of resistance and skepticism, not in my backyardism, in those local communities. And it creates a very limited, localized capacity for housing produced using automation. And we know what's key to the climate crisis is this idea of localization, so we can't ignore this major issue. Now, we like to think about the idea of the modular problem. So the efficiencies of modular construction are really compromised by centralized factories that take this huge CapEx and OpEx. These factories require huge amounts of funding, and they result in a very long payback time. And the margins that are achieved here are relatively low. Centralized factories require a high degree of repetition. They're not able to efficiently adapt to clients' briefs, site, or legal constraints, and this results in very repetitive, one-size-fits-all housing, or really this kind of almost lack of market. And the process of customizing these modular housing products is very expensive. Now, in this kind of model, construction still remains very fragmented, and bad habits from the construction site merely take place in a large shed. So we really see this as a failing model. They fail to scale beyond a single region, place, or country. And therefore, it's not really a problem. The modular problem isn't really a problem of efficiency or productivity. It's a problem of design. And design for us touches on frameworks for labor, it touches on frameworks for interdependence, for policy making, and care. And it's really important to note that all of these practices are historically constructed, and they're designed practices. And insofar as they can be historically constructed, they can be redesigned and reconstructed. And one of the ways that we've looked at this is through how digital architecture historically has tried to very much play innocent. But automation isn't innocent. Automation immediately forces positions. It forces questions about what a more automated society would look like. Would we all need universal basic income in a world run by robots? Who owns these robots? What are the spatial and social structures that robots and other forms occupy? And how is our work and architectural production augmented? So we published a book now 3 years ago where we explored these questions called Robotic Building, Architecture in the Age of Automation. And in the book, we argue that there are very deep cultural issues within architectural production that highlight the incapacity of current practices to adapt to automation. Now, when we are forced to use this term, automation, we are forced to think about these the labor structures, platforms, data, but also about control and about ownership. And then we're really forced to see automation as a design project. And that was the real thesis of this book and has continued to be the thesis of AUAR. So what then is an architecture or an architectural framework designed for automation? Now, what we've proposed in our work is a radical redesign of how architectural parts are in relationship to automation in two ways, both as a process and as a framework for production. So, for example, in relationship to the context that we are working. And one of the questions that we like to ask here is how easy is it for people to benefit to access the benefits of automation? Now, what that has done in our work is resulted in a proposition that a significant number of architectural parts is possible, down from thousands to one. And this enables a rethink around the dichotomy that exists between design and building cultures. Now, this is an approach known as the discrete, where architectural parts are not constrained to types like column or floor slab or beam or staircase, and instead we think of them as similar to code. The same building part can be used to construct, as in this image, this is a student work from 2017, every single part of a building structure. Now, within this are values around the intersection between automation and material optimization. In our discrete housing system, one sheet of timber material equals one discrete building block that is repeatedly cut and can be manufactured almost anywhere in this kind of just-in-time model for production. Now, this version of our building system is quite old now, is a prefabricated post-tension system which incorporated reversible connections that allow for reconfiguration and adaptation of that system over time. And now, as you'll see in later images, it's designed both for manual and fully automated assembly, from the scale of the sheet to block, but also the block to block, and what we call chunk to chunk. Now, this is based on principles of digital materials, a concept from mechanical engineering that has behind it principles of part variation and part reversibility. Now, part of the discrete approach is about embedding enough intelligence and simplicity into architectural parts to enable people to engage with them and interact with them in very intuitive ways. So part of that intelligence is to design ways of working that can empower communities to participate both in the design and making, to take back this kind of power and to create the homes and spaces that they need. Now, this version of the block used very simple tools and required very little expertise and training to both prefab and assemble. Now, in the spin-out company, we're now fully automating a new version of the block for the prefabrication, so from sheet to block and from building assembly. That decreases the manual assembly tasks that we really, really hate to do. There's nothing worse than banging in 1,000 T-nuts. So if we move away a little bit from an architectural part and towards the framework for automation and architectural production, we can largely acknowledge that automation has been largely centralized and largely extracted. So what we're interested in exploring is how can we embed notions of collectivity into frameworks for automation, where both workers have ownership over the methods and the modes of production, as well as the things that they produce. And a key part of that for us is trying to design frameworks for automation that distribute expertise and keeps the value that's co-created by the communities that we're working with within those very communities that are producing. And I'll show you how we're starting to do that in some of our more community-focused work in the lab. So I'd like to argue that a vision of automation as a design project can be one that really harnesses distribution. And this, we say, demonstrates the capacity for automation to accelerate this kind of distributed abundance rather than scarcity that allows us to amplify interdependence. It allows us to begin to confront marginalization, divisiveness that exists within the industry. And there's kind of three core principles for us in our vision for automation. One, it has to always confront the value systems and hierarchies that are embedded in architectural, social, and spatial practices by radically rethinking the part. We also must redefine automation's capacity to enable increasing access to architectural production. And we always must consider automation not as solving only very localized problems. It must be transcalar and distributed. Now, the projects I'm going to show you really, I hope, speak to this vision. So for the last 3 years, we've been collaborating with two communities, primarily two communities, one in South Bristol, where I live, and a community in Hackney and East London, in very parallel ways. And what we've been doing in both of those places is working alongside residents and local policy makers, primarily because these are two groups that are very disadvantaged by the status quo, in that there's a huge lack of trust from communities on the one hand, and on the other, a really significant inability to take risk. So our work sometimes might look like a very localized project if we zoom in really close to these places, but we also see this as a large-scale project in the making. So in these locations, we've embedded ourselves not in your typical factory settings for housing production. On the left is a youth space that we took over for 6 weeks, and on the right is a bricklaying workshop, which we've occupied on and off from, I guess, towards the end of 2020 to part of 2021. And we argue that by embedding and distributing automation into these localized settings, we can design and deploy a much larger coordinated network that can operate using our tools and techniques between these communities. And this allows knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer that otherwise doesn't exist when we treat projects as one-offs. So this is Block West. We built this in 2020. It was a COVID miracle. Miracle baby, let's say. We started the project like a week before lockdown, so we had to take everything that was supposed to be in person and do it online for 6 months, and then we came together in August of 2020 to build Block West. So Block West was built out of 145 blocks and assembled together in less than 2 weeks, and it provided 25 part-time jobs in the local community throughout the 6 months of the project. And I'd literally encourage you not to see this as a pavilion. It's really a housing prototype where we co-produce methodologies for engagement with new technologies alongside and in collaboration with our community partners. And we were really looking at developing an asset-based approach to reveal what was needed in this community context and how automation such as robotics and AR and VR could really serve those needs. This also acted as a training program for more permanent roles being created by some of our community partners in the We Can Make Homes project, which has identified 400 microsites in South Bristol alone. In Block West, our group of 25 was also 50% women and people aged 17 to 76. We also had a 12-year-old one day, and she banged her thumb with a mallet, and we had to take her off the site. Health and safety was questionable that day. But last year, we were really pleased because Block West was awarded the Architects Journal Small Projects Award for the Social Sustainability Prize. The jury noted the way that it engaged with local communities, describing it as an intersectional piece of architecture that goes beyond a building and raised important questions about how we live together. Now, 2 years on, our patent-pending timber cassettes form the cornerstone of our technology stack, and this allows for increased automation and a hyper-short production chain. Our robotic platform enables efficiency in production with very low-cost assets, and our robots allow for this radical reduction of labor in the prefabrication process, but also improving on quality and precision. Now, key to this is that, yeah, we have cool robots, fine, but everything is really simulated down to the very bolt in our digital supply chain model, which I'm not going to talk a lot on. I know Next Build people love supply chain models. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But we obsessively collect data on every part of our project. And because the timber cassette is so simple, we're able to do that because, it's very simple. So talking a little bit about how we've been setting up some of these projects. This is a project called We Can Fab, which was a citizen-led housing factory, also in South Bristol, that was funded by Innovate UK. We were part of the Housing for Inclusive Growth, 3.2 million demonstrator out there. We were a tiny, tiny little part of that big project. But we developed a digital manufacturing platform for multiple modular building systems, such as Mass Bespoke, U-Build, and Block Build, to be produced alongside ours in a localized microfactory setting. And collectively, we imagined that this digital platform could be deployed in cooperative models for practice, where multiple practices are coming together to serve a neighborhood or a city or a region and their housing needs. Now, we took many of these learnings from this project forward to set up our first microfactory with the support of ABB Robotics in Milton Keynes in the autumn of last year. We ended up taking the prototypical microfactory setup using our housing product and robotic integration to the Global Investment Summit in October as one of 12 companies selected in the UK as green tech innovators. And then we accelerated this microfactory and iterated our product, prototyping a 2-story housing product earlier this year, where we secured a project for 15 homes we go on site for next year. So we can now achieve this. We can assemble our timber cassettes in 45 seconds. We can prefab all the parts for an 80 square meter house in 3 hours. We can assemble a house in 3 days, and we can hit a price point of 1,000 pounds per square meter. Our microfactory platform enables our projects to be adapted and customized to sites, client briefs, building codes, and we can do this at no extra cost because our production line is entirely digital. We'd like to use the term "a house is not a car" because we can't use the same model, which is from the 20th century, to produce housing. It's too old, it's too boring. Now, our work with the microfactories has also led us to co-develop the design of a community embedded housing factory. This is part of the Weekend Fab project, and this extends existing fabrication and manufacturing capacity for citizen-led housing in South Bristol, and then over time is adapted into housing. In our work, we have engaged with how we can provide access to knowledge about these technologies. For example, in our work with 16 to 18-year-olds at New City College enrolled in a construction program, we provided a program of work experience, bringing young adults in contact with these kinds of technologies that for them seemed really distant and that they couldn't connect with them. And it was a really important piece of work for us because it allowed us to ask new kinds of questions around where we can impact on that knowledge gap. So to expand on how to kind of deal with that knowledge gap, we've been working on this project in East London for the last 3 years that sought to make the potential of automation really tangible to local communities and begin to close that knowledge gap. This is House Block, and it was part of a project with Hackney Council to begin to understand how it can use smaller bits of land. In London alone, there's 600,000 small sites that have been identified for development. Hackney Council calls them nothing spaces. I would say that they are not nothing spaces. They are incredibly diverse spaces. And part of this project was about how can we engage local communities in network building for rethinking housing production. So House Block was built on a disused playground in Clapton in a hyper-diverse residential community. It was adapted over time through a series of takeovers by our community partners that included Studio Wayne McGregor, East London Dance, the Building Center, Waltham Forest Future Creatives Program. And this formed a public program over the course of a month with sound installations and roundtables, performances, talks, you name it, we did it. We had an amazing barbecue. It was, I think, the first opening after COVID. I mean, outside, so everyone was really happy, but it was the first opening. We were quite chuffed. So House Block really began to explore the relationship between manual and automated assembly methods that we've been developing in our lab, trying to understand at what points and what moments in construction should we be embedding automation. And we see House Block demonstrating what could be achieved if we were to think about participatory approaches to housing, where local communities can make use of these modes of production. And we've been able to show that this kind of project brings on board communities that are otherwise perceived to be disparate and disconnected in the conversation about the future of housing. House Block was an evolving and living project. This is a speculation on House Block, its takeovers, and then it turning into a housing project. And it was largely informed, the takeovers were largely unscripted and informed by the people that engaged with them. We provided local paid opportunities for residents. We provided 60 part-time weekend jobs in the community, including providing childcare and tools. And some of these people have continued to work with us on other projects in different parts of the country. So in the last year, we've launched 2 housing products, the first being a 1-story housing product designed for backyard homes, ADUs, annexes, meanwhile use, that sort of thing, garden studios. And these block studios use a small enough number of blocks to be able to fit in the back of a Luton van. This makes them super easy to transport from the production places that are nearby to their sites. And this allows us to really further rethink what a factory might look like when it's embedded in a community. This is really also guided by the overarching ambition to understand through the lived experience of the people we're working with what expanded ideas of housing production could look like and what could they offer smaller sites, but also how it could scale up to larger sites. Now, we're further developing this approach alongside our partnership with ABB Robotics, and this enables us to test and iterate our microfactory approach. We have new jobs being opened within AUAR called Maker Builders, who will be working alongside our system automation team, really embedding traditional crafts within the business as well. So the next stage of our work, those maker builders are being embedded in the communities that we're working within microfactories that can fulfill communities' ongoing housing needs, which we see as key to the social infrastructure that fills that knowledge gap around automation. This is a project that we finished just last week. We're having an opening on the 1st of July, very exciting, for a small startup in South London. It's 50 square meters and is designed to adapt to their needs over time, with the floor plan designed for smaller spaces to be created longer term. The small startup has young children who will become big children who need their own space. You can see us next at Summerset House, the summer festival, This Bright Land, in August, where we've designed the clubhouse at the center of the plaza, again, kind of using some of the ideas around house block to engage a much wider set of, a very different but wider community. This is an event sponsored by the Mayor of London. I think it was just announced last week. But taking on this infill problem and continuing the community-focused temporary projects is really not the end game for us. We see that smaller scale of 1 to 2 stories as a way of de-risking our processes and our technologies to take on larger projects, working with developers at first and eventually becoming developers ourselves. The end game is really not just changing the way that we build, but changing the way that we live and how we buy and own and trade the spaces we live in. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mollie. That was great, and thank you for keeping us on time. We've got time for one question for Mollie, and then perhaps we can engage with Mollie during the lunch break. Quick question for Mollie. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, one question.
Hi, Mollie.
Hi.
Kieran Garrick from Allies Morrison. Firstly, that was really fascinating, so thanks for presenting that. Quite a specific question, I guess. One of your first videos showed the robotic simulation of building a brick wall with mortar between it. Your concept here is clearly focused on assembly, and I assume disassembly then, so it has the sustainability credentials that go with that. Do you think, when we think of off-site construction, that the idea of 3D printing of buildings and the use of, let's call it glue instead of assembly, doesn't stack up anymore?
Short answer is yes. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations in the last 24 hours about the promise of high-performance concrete, and we see that happening in other startups that are in California that I shall not name. But I do see that those are very static. They oftentimes are not really able to adapt over time. And what's key to providing some alternative to the climate crisis is adaptation. And we know this from nature, right? So what's key in our building system is not the block itself, it's the connections between the blocks. That is where the intelligence really lies, and that connection allows us to embed adaptation and predict what that might look like. So everything is modularized down to the bolt, right? And that allows us to kind of be able to predict things like durability issues, be able to take bits out and replace them. And that creates a whole other kind of landscape for the way that we think about our homes and the way that we think about how our communities can serve our needs. And I think that that's really a counter to 3D printing. And I hope, a more exciting one, because the kinds of spaces that we're able to design, I would argue, are more inspiring.
Thank you.